This is Coffee with Kelly, a dynamic podcast that's dedicated to driving positive change in school safety. I'm your host, Ethan Woodman, Product Marketing Specialist for Crisis Go, and I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, Kelly Moore, Senior School Safety Specialist for Crisis Go. Our mission is to empower you with essential knowledge, tools, and inspiration required to foster a safer and more secure school environment. We hope this podcast will be the catalyst for transformation in your schools. Join us as we continue to dive into the world of school safety. Good evening, Kelly. I almost said good morning, but
You almost did. Yeah.
It's technically evening.
Yeah.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. We still like coffee in the afternoon.
Yeah, I just finished a cup.
Did you?
Yeah. That's what keeps me going. That's what I got run through my veins.
Yeah, I'm going to try to go to bed early because we're traveling tomorrow.
So is that like 6 o'clock or?
Oh, I have to be at the airport at 4 o'clock. So.
Right. But so are you going to bed at like 6?
8-ish.
Oh man.
What do we got?
I have an interesting little side story. I don't know if it's going to be entertaining or not, but
I'm sure it will be.
I finally went and did a pulmonary function test.
Uh-huh.
And this is from the whole pneumonia episode that I had for 3 months.
Over the summer,
which killed my summer, basically. So I finally went in and did that test. And man, that was a workout for my lungs. I was like winded. They make you do all these exercises, breathing in and out and all these different ways. And you have to breathe out, basically try to remove all of the air in your lungs.
Yeah.
And
how'd you do? Well, you must have passed because you're still here.
Yeah. I tell you, there was one moment where I was definitely getting lightheaded. You're in this one person tube with a door on the front. Did it have an
escape hatch at the bottom?
I wouldn't surprise me.
Just dump you.
It felt like a spaceship. So then they close the door and you have to you hear an airlock thing going on. It's and then the person on the outside's hey, can you hear me? And it's it's got a speaker. So it's I was on a spaceship.
Mm-hmm. They do that because they actually measure the capacity of the air that's going in and out, right?
Yeah. So I had to breathe into this other machine thing. But yeah, it was it's very interesting that we can, it just amazes me that we've engineered machines to record and analyze breaths.
Yeah.
It's wild. What a time to be alive.
What a time to be alive. What do we got going today, Ethan?
Well, so as probably everyone in the entire world has seen, the western side of the United States is up in flames.
Well, Los Angeles.
That's what they make it seem like, but
it's this big compared
how many
West.
How many acres is it? Do you know?
It's got to be close to 20,000 ish.
20,000
for the Palisades fire. I'm paying more attention to that than the Eden fire or the other 2 or 3 fires that are going.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. There's
super crazy.
I was watching some video about it of estimating the cost to rebuild those houses. All the things you don't think about, permits and this and that. And it's just for each house, it's just racks up.
Yeah. Wow, especially those houses, right? That's
gonna be a nightmare.
Those were huge houses in one of the most expensive areas to live in the United States, if not the world. And
crazy.
So I'll tell you, when you start talking permits and stuff like that, generally speaking, they figure a way to expedite all that stuff. The bigger problem is the insurance companies and trying to get them to determine who's responsible for that.
Can you imagine working at the place where you have to approve the permits and be the person that deals with that?
Yeah. So when I was the incident commander at one of the largest fires at the time in California, it's no longer, it's 3rd or 5th or something like that now. But then we had a flood right afterwards that wiped houses completely off their foundations. right? And so what they did to expedite the permits was they agreed that if you are just rebuilding your house and you weren't expanding it or changing the footprint anyway, that they would accept that as the plan and expedite the permits to do that. So it took what would generally require reviews and architectural reviews and all those things. It take months and months. They went through and made it essentially a 30-day process. So as long as you were doing the same footprint, then you were good to go. Although some places, some houses were, because of where they were situated and the risk at being victims in the near future again, they weren't allowed to rebuild. There's a lot of things to think about because there's a lot of insurance companies that are getting out of that market. They're not insuring your houses if you live in certain areas and this is all over the nation. So actually there's one community just south of where I lived. There is not a single insurance company that will insure your house there. So all of the houses there, you have to buy, understanding that, and you have to buy it for cash. And it's in a small little enclave right across the Highway 101 from the ocean. So it's highly desirable, but only people who have that kind of money can live there. But they understand that.
So how do these fires in California relate to school safety, since we are a school safety podcast?
Yeah, we are. And well, directly, there was a school or two that burned down in this, right?
Wow.
So now there's a lot of schools that were impacted by the evacuations. There were a lot of schools that had to close because of the air quality. And when you have an event like this, it impacts everybody, right? And schools are often the center of those communities. Everyone in that community touches those schools at one point or another. And when you start looking at the impact that an outside event has on your school, you got to start thinking about continuity of operations. We've talked about this before, but how are we going to deliver our services to our student base if we can't get them to school or they can't get to school? Right. And we've talked about this before. You're more likely to become impacted by this type of event than you are an act of violence. Right. We spent a lot of time talking about violence and because of those issues that come along with it. But you're actually more likely to be impacted, especially when you're in you live in these areas that have these hazards. And when we talk about all hazards, we talk about, do you know the hazards in your area? And in Southern California specifically, wildfires come up all of the time. The last 15 years of actually it was longer than that. It was close to 20 plus years. I was dealing with some sort of disaster, at least on a yearly basis. Most of them were fires, but there were large scale flooding. There have been earthquakes. There's all of these different events that are pretty regular. So when we start talking about all hazards, this is kind of the stuff. It may not impact your school directly on site, but this is impacting every school in Southern California right now. Not just in LA, but all of those other schools that are now having to deal with bad air. The quality of air is significant. And I lived about 100 miles north of Los Angeles, and the air quality there is horrible. And so there's air quality alerts going on in where I used to live, and that's 100 miles away. So, and the prevailing winds are from the west to the east. In these winds, they're from the east coming over the mountains. They're called Santa Anas, over the mountains, and then they go to the west. Well, what happens is you blow all of that smoke out to the west, and then the prevailing winds come back and bring it all back in. So you get whacked by it twice, essentially. So that's stuff that you have to deal with.
This is almost where like COVID had a positive impact. because now these schools kind of like know what to do because they can do school from home, maybe?
There's a lot of negative impacts of after COVID on how far behind are you. I don't know if there was any studies done on there were studies done on the impacts of the long-term virtual schooling. I
Sure.
don't know that there
Sure.
was on the short term, and frankly, that takes a little bit of time, especially if we're 2 years away, 3 years away from COVID now, when everyone kind of went back to normal. I will tell you, in that short period of time, there are probably, while most of the educators had dealt with some aspect of COVID, I will venture to say there's a good portion of it, a significant percentage of the administrators who are now in place who didn't deal with it from an operational perspective. They
Interesting.
were
Okay.
they weren't integral in putting that action into plan. And and frankly, when I was at the school district the last few months at the very beginning of COVID, I talked to them about the continuity of operations plans, the COOP. And they said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, when I've talked to you guys about this earlier, when I was working for them, this is what I meant. How are you going to provide services to your students? And so COVID forced you to do that. So you really should be memorializing what you did in COVID for two reasons. One, that's your COOP. How are we going to provide these services when our normal operations are interrupted? What do we need to do? How do we need to get students back to the books, so to speak, right? And the other thing is as bad as this sounds, we have to realize as soon as we make a decision like that the first time, it's easier to make the second time. And you see some right now, you see some mentions of, and I think it's somebody dipping their toe in the water, of this bird flu. We had a death. We have this. So there's some people who are looking towards, is this the next pandemic? And if so, are we prepared for that? And how is that going to impact us? And they should be looking at it from that perspective. But at what point are they going to try to pull that plug again and say, whoop, here we go? And are our schools ready to go through that again? I think this time they've learned a lot in saying how much of the negative impact that was. So I think they're going to do it differently. I would hope, for lots of people's sake, I hope they would do it differently and try to figure out how to educate our kids better under similar circumstances.
All right. So then we're also going to talk about what safety directors should be doing right now.
This week.
Mm-hmm. This week.
Yep.
This week being mid-January.
Yep. Mid-January, the second, third week of January. So we just got out of break. And as we've discussed many, many times, this period of time, the first 2 or 3 weeks of returning from a long break, increase our probability of having a violent incident at our schools. So now's the time for us to be super vigilant, not for acts of violence, but for the precursors for the acts of violence. Human behavior, mental health issues, depression, changes in behavior, isolating themselves, acting out, challenging authority more, just odd behavior for somebody, and you have to establish that baseline. And the reason I say that, obviously, we're trying to bring that response time before or to the left of bang. And so now's the time for us to make sure that our teachers are educated on what to look for, how to report it, who to report it to, how those persons who are receiving those reports, how do they respond, and so forth. But this is how we should be really looking at creating that sort of positive experience at school, that positive relationship with a trusted adult, is if you see something, walk up to them and say, hey, how's it going today? You look like you're struggling a bit. Let's talk about that and go through what we can do to support you there. Should we be doing that every day? Yes.
Yeah.
The problem is statistically, we have a higher incident of these events after an extended vacation or break. So we should be doing that. The next thing here is last week being the first week of the return from the break for most of us, we should be looking at continuing with our drill sequencing. So last week we talked about having the drill for the month set forth, the scenario communicated to your safety teams from the district level. Your district safety director should be calling all of your building people in. They should have done this last week and saying, okay, here's the drill. Here's what we are doing. And walking through all of the objectives of the drills, asking any questions. And if you are using a communications app like Crisis Go, you should be exercising the use of that within your drill. So you should be teaching them how to make sure that they all understand how to send an alert, how to check in, how to do a roster event, how to release the drill, those types of things. You should make sure that all of those building administrators understand that. This week, your building administrators should be doing the same with their teams. So with their safety teams, they should be going through the drill itself and making sure they understand all of the objectives, make sure they understand exactly what they're looking for when they evaluate the drill. This is a really good time to bring in your first responders, depending on the drill, and make sure that what you're doing aligns with what they're going to do. Sometime during this week, you should run the drill as a tabletop exercise. If you need to do that as a district safety team level, and bring all of those administrators back to run that tabletop so that they know how to run a tabletop at their district or at their building, then you should do that so that they can walk through all of the pieces. If any questions come up, they can come up with a good response that's unified across the way. If this happens, this is what we're going to say. If this is happening, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to respond, etc. Because over the next 2 weeks from now, all of your buildings are going to be required to run a drill, some of which you will evaluate, some of which the building level people will evaluate, so that we can get some feedback as to what's going on, make our improvements, determine what went right, what went wrong, what policies need to be changed, and identify any training needs, those types of issues. And then the last thing that we should be doing as safety directors this week, your budget requests should be finalized. If not, very soon, because most of the districts are finalizing their overall budget. And when I say budget, I mean time and money, because they're making plans for next year. They're finalizing all of those plans for next year. The cabinet's going to sit down in the next couple of weeks, if not the next few days, and they're going to start saying, okay, we can do this. We have to do this. We have to do this. Oh, we're not going to do that. And you want a seat at that table, and you want to argue for your positions, your budget, your training needs. When are you going to schedule? What does your drill schedule look like for next year? What security equipment, technology, what do you need for that? How are you going to implement those? All of those things need to be finalized. And we talk budgets all of the times, whether it's budgeting your time or budgeting your funds. We talk about it all the time. And we say, well, we just don't have it. Well, it's because we don't have a budgeting plan. And frankly, I think that's where safety directors are failing. They're not advocating for that. And they're not going out and saying this, hey, look, we have this mandate. I need these things to meet these mandates. I need this time to train people to meet this mandate. We're going to do these drills to meet this mandate. And for me to do that, I need this much time to train. They need to start mandating or looking at those tasks, start checking those off. I will reiterate this. If anybody out there wants an e-copy of my school safety director's log, maps out every week for the school year for the most part, and it has some recommended or suggested tasks that should be done each week. Obviously, it's essentially a to-do list, but it allows you to look at some of the things that I think would be good for you to be doing. If they don't fit or work for you, okay, I've allowed space for you to create your own checklist. But those are things that you can put into your plan, and those are things that you can establish in the right time during the cycle of your school business cycle to make sure that you have what you need for next year. If you didn't get what you needed this year, it was probably because you didn't ask for it a year ago.
Makes sense.
Please reach out to us if that's something that you would like a copy of. Be happy to send that to people.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. And if you have any questions about what we discussed, leave a comment on our website at crisisgo.com. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time on Coffee with Kelly, a discussion on school safety.